Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's only one big story out of Washington this week, and it's actually Washington when it goes to Europe. Vice President JD Vance has just delivered an absolute haymaker of a speech in Munich, laying down the law to the European Union and NATO members who, for years, have been banging on about how they are defending democracy, all while undermining it every day in their very own nations. Now, Vance was the U.S.'s representative at the Munich Security Conference, but he did not deliver the expected polite speech full of approved nostrums and talking points about Ukraine and fighting the far right, whatever that means. Instead, Vance came offering a sort of, and I think there's only one word for this, an intervention. Yes, it was an intervention like you might do with a family member with an addiction problem. Only here, the family member wasn't an uncle or an aunt or a son with a drinking problem or a nasty coke habit, but instead it was Europe, from which our shared Western civilization sprung, but which has lately developed its own terrible addiction to censorship, third world migration, and social control. Now, in his speech, Vance told this incredible story about a man in Scotland who was arrested for silently, yes, that's right, silently, in his own head, praying near an abortion clinic. And how later people who lived in the area and in other areas around abortion clinics were told to report anyone they knew doing anything similar, even in their own homes.
Oh, jeez.
This is chilling.
2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
Amazing stuff. And by the way, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, here's the letter that Vance refers to that people in Scotland got, warning them that indeed a private place, such as a house, could be considered a prayer-free zone if it was too close to an abortion clinic. Now, Vance is right. Free speech is in retreat across Europe. And almost every week on this program, we bring you new examples of the Orwellian thought control apparatuses being brought to bear on a population that is beset by terrorism and knife crime, but where the real problem for the authorities seems to be thought crime. Here's more of what Vance had to say about this.
And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action.
But that's not the only European problem that Vance called out. The vice president was also brutal about the policies of some countries, particularly Germany, that have allowed themselves to deindustrialize.
Germany is the one country, maybe, in NATO that did not follow the stupid Washington consensus and allow their country to be deindustrialized during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And yet at the very moment that Putin is more and more powerful, where the Russian army is invading European countries en masse, this is the point at which Germany starts to deindustrialize? Look at the number of people working in manufacturing in Germany now versus 10 years ago. Look at the critical raw materials produced in Germany now versus 10 years ago. The energy dependence now versus 10 or 20 years ago. We have got to stop deindustrializing. We want Europe to be successful, but Europe has got to take a bigger role in its own security. You can't do that without industry.
Now, I'd go further and say it is amazing that Germany has inflicted on itself the same rustication that some in the U.S. government wanted to force on them, and thankfully they didn't succeed after World War II. But it was on the subject of mass migration that Vance really opened up.
The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course it's gotten much higher since. And we know the situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade.
Vance noted that just the day before his speech, there was another Islamist car ramming attack in Munich, the very city where he was speaking.
We saw the horrors wrought by these decisions yesterday in this very city. And of course, I can't bring it up again without thinking about the terrible victims who had a beautiful winter day in Munich ruined. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and will remain with them. But why did this happen in the first place? It's a terrible story, but it's one we've heard way too many times in Europe and unfortunately too many times in the United States as well. An asylum seeker, often a young man in his mid-20s, already known to police, rams a car into a crowd and shatters a community. How many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction?
Yet, Vance said, European leaders were ignoring what people were urgently crying out for: to be heard and to have their votes and their voices respected, rather than being blamed for having the wrong ideas or for supposedly being influenced by outside voices from beyond their own shores. Have a listen to this, and note at the end there's the name of an old friend of this program here. Have a listen.
I believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk.
Ah, yes, remember Greta? Yes, it was fine for her to bully leaders around the world and terrify children, including here in Australia, and tell them to go on strike for the climate. But Elon Musk? Oh no! Mean tweets incoming! Look, the whole speech was an absolute tour de force, a banger. But what Vance was saying to the Europeans is this: you are making yourselves unrecognizable culturally, politically, socially, and running against all the values of liberty and enlightenment that once made you European and which gave the world the gift of your civilization. And now you expect to be defended by America even as you run yourself down? The whole speech could be summed up by this one line from Vance, which I think deserves to go down in history as his Ich bin ein Berliner moment.
If you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you. Nor, for that matter, is there anything that you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump.
How perfectly put. Europe is running in fear of its own voters. And it was, again, I say this again, an intervention. Yet, as the saying goes, there are none so blind as those who will not see. The Europeans in the audience were horrified to cop this lecture from this upstart colonial. Here's left-wing German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius.
This democracy that was just called into question by the US Vice President, and not just the German democracy, but Europe as a whole. He spoke of the annulment of democracy, and if I understood him correctly, he compares the condition of Europe with the condition that prevails in some authoritarian regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not acceptable.
And everyone clapped. Well, they may be cheering him now, but it is Vance who was in the right here. And in a few days' time, Germany will go to the polls, and the right-wing AfD is looking to be in the box seat while authorities try to do everything in their power to smother that party's vote. As ordinary Germans become increasingly fed up with crime, migration, terrorism, and the running down of their once great nation by the left. The big question now is, as Vance suggests, will the people's voice in Germany be allowed to be heard, or will it be silenced? And if it is silenced, well, remind us again what gives them to the right to lecture the rest of us about democracy. What is this Europe exactly that we are defending?